I used to believe that blood was the strongest bond in the world, that no matter how cruel life became, no matter how bitter disappointments turned, family would always be the thread holding me together. Maybe that was a fantasy I clung to because I was the older sister, the protector, the one who gave up her own dreams to make sure her younger brother had his chance. His name is Daniel, 4 years younger than me, but in so many ways I always felt like his second mother. When our father died young and our mother struggled to raise us, it was me who worked nights at the diner while still finishing school. It was me who gave up a scholarship to stay close to home so Daniel could go to college debt-free. And it was me who cheered the loudest when he graduated in a cap and gown, while I sat quietly in the crowd wearing a waitress uniform that still smelled of grease. I never resented him, not once, because I believed we were a team. That one day when I was older and worn down, Daniel would look back and realize how much I had carried for him. I thought gratitude would blossom into loyalty, but gratitude, I've learned, can turn sour in some hearts. It can become entitlement. Daniel built a career in real estate. He was charming, bold, and knew how to sell a dream. I watched him grow from a nervous 20-something showing rental apartments into a confident man brokering million-dollar homes. And while he built his empire, I built my own smaller success. I invested carefully, worked hard, and after my husband passed, I poured my energy into growing our family business. I wasn't flashy, but I was steady. For years, Daniel and I were close. Sunday dinners, family vacations, holidays spent together. He called me sis with affection, and I believed him. But small things began to shift. Little cracks in the glass. It started with his silences. When I asked about his investments, he'd change the subject. When I pressed about why he no longer brought his family to my house for Thanksgiving, he claimed he was too busy, and when mother passed and the estate needed to be divided, Daniel suddenly became different. I remember sitting across from him in the lawyer's office, grief still heavy in my chest. Our mother's pearls lay in a velvet box between us, the last of her treasures, and Daniel said, as casually as if we were discussing the weather, I think it makes more sense if I handle everything. You've never really been good with numbers. It was like being slapped in the face, not because of the words, but because of the coldness in his voice. This was the brother I'd carried on my hip as a toddler, the boy whose nightmares I soothed when thunderstorms rattled our windows. Now, he looked at me like I was an obstacle. I told myself it was just stress. That grief made people sharp. I agreed to let him handle things, thinking it would smooth the way. But weeks turned into months, and I started noticing documents I hadn't signed, accounts I hadn't been told about, and assets that had somehow been reallocated. At first, I confronted him gently. Daniel, I thought Mom's savings account was split evenly. He laughed, dismissing me with a wave. Sis, you wouldn't understand. These things are complicated. Complicated. That was his favorite word. What it really meant was, sit down, be quiet, and let me take what I want. I wanted to believe I was imagining it. I wanted to believe my brother, my blood, would never betray me. But betrayal doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like water through a cracked roof, until one day the whole ceiling collapses. Life went on, but there was a shift I couldn't ignore. One Sunday afternoon, I drove past Daniel's new house in the upscale part of town. A grand place, modern with glass walls and a circular driveway. There were 3 luxury cars parked outside, and all I could think was, how did he afford this so quickly? Meanwhile, I was still running the modest business. My husband and I had built an antique shop on Main Street. I wasn't struggling, but I wasn't swimming in wealth either. What stung wasn't the comparison, but the gnawing suspicion that Daniel had used money that wasn't entirely his. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills, when a memory struck me. Years ago, when we were kids, Daniel had borrowed a $20 bill from me, swearing he'd pay me back the next day. He never did. I laughed it off back then, telling myself he's just a kid. What does $20 matter? But sitting there, older and wiser, I realized it had always been Daniel's way, taking what wasn't his because he believed I'd never demand it back. And maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I had taught him that my sacrifices were his entitlements, that I would always bend, and he would always take. Weeks later, the first real confrontation came. I discovered by accident through a mutual friend that Daniel had sold one of Mother's properties, a small rental house she'd left us. I hadn't been told. I hadn't signed anything. When I called him, my voice trembling, he answered cheerfully, "Oh, that old place? It wasn't worth much. I took care of it. You took care of it," I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. "Daniel, that was supposed to be ours. Together, you had no right." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Sis, you're overreacting. You don't need the stress of managing these things. I'm protecting you. Protecting me." That was the excuse. As if betrayal could be disguised as love, I hung up that night with my heart pounding, my trust splintering. For the first time in my life, I wondered if I truly knew my brother at all. The days after were filled with sleepless nights. I would wake at 2 in the morning, pacing my living room, replaying every conversation we'd ever had. How had I missed the signs? How had I blinded myself to his greed? But even then, some part of me clung to hope. Hope that he would wake up, realize what he'd done, and make amends. Hope that the boy I once carried on my shoulders still existed inside the man. Because if I admitted the truth, that my own brother was betraying Met, would mean shattering not just our bond, but the very foundation of what I believed family meant, and that I wasn't ready for that was the beginning. The small cracks, I didn't know then how deep they would go. I didn't know that Daniel's hunger would grow sharper, that his betrayal would carve into me more cruelly than any enemy's blade could. But life has a way of teaching us, brutally and without mercy, the lessons we resist the most. And soon, I would learn the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes, the people we protect with everything we have are the very ones who will destroy us. And when that day came, I knew I would have to decide whether to let him break me, or to rise from the ruins stronger than ever before. I always thought betrayal felt like a knife in the back, something sudden and sharp. But what I learned in those first few months was that sometimes betrayal is quieter, more deliberate, like watching someone you love place stones on your chest one by one until you cannot breathe. My brother Daniel had been that person. The boy who used to chase me through the fields, the young man who swore he would always protect me, the brother who carried our family's name like it was sacred. Now, he was the man quietly strangling me with debts, documents, and deceit, and I was only beginning to understand just how deep his treachery ran. The trouble began the day the first letter arrived from the bank. It wasn't unusual for me to receive official mail regarding our family estate after all. I had been handling the affairs since our parents passed away, but this envelope carried a weight that made my hands tremble. Inside was a notification of an overdue loan payment, a loan I had never taken with my name signed across the agreement. At first I thought it was a mistake, some clerical error. I told myself the bank must have mixed up files, perhaps another family with a similar name. But when I walked into the manager's office with the letter clutched tightly in my hand, the truth fell on me like a hammer. The loan was real. The signature was mine, or rather, it was a perfect imitation of mine. Daniel's handwriting had always been eerily similar to mine, a fact we used to laugh about when we were children. That similarity had now become a weapon against me. The manager looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and sympathy as I stammered my denial. I could feel my cheeks burning, my voice breaking. He showed me the paperwork, not just one loan, but 3, all taken within the last year, all signed in my name, and each one tied to the estate we had inherited together that night. I sat alone in my father's study, staring at the papers spread across the desk. I could smell the faint trace of tobacco on the leather chair, the ghost of my father's presence lingering in the air. My heart broke as I realized Daniel had not only forged my name, but had risked the very land that had been in our family for generations. Our parents had worked themselves into the ground to preserve it for us, and now it was dangling over the edge of ruin. When I confronted Daniel, he didn't even bother to deny it. He leaned back in his chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and looked at me with that infuriating mixture of arrogance and calm. "You don't understand," he said. "I did this for us. The land needed improvements, investments. I found opportunities, and I took them. You should be thanking me. Thanking you." My voice cracked with rage. "You forged my name. You put me in debt without my consent. You risked everything we have." He smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You're overreacting. Once the projects pay off, you'll see. This is how business works. Risks, rewards. You're too cautious to understand." But deep down, I knew this wasn't about business. Daniel wasn't investing for us. He was gambling for himself, gambling with my name, my future, my sanity. The days that followed blurred into sleepless nights and anxious mornings. Calls from creditors became constant. Letters arrived like steady blows to the chest. And all the while, Daniel remained unfazed. He spent money freely, attended lavish dinners, and made connections with people who smelled of deceit and opportunism. He had stepped into a world of wealth and power that fed his ego, and he didn't care who he destroyed on the way there. The real breaking point came when I discovered the property transfer. Hidden among the mountain of documents was a deed showing that Daniel had attempted to transfer partial ownership of the estate to one of his new business partners. The signature on the document, again mine. He had been willing to sell me out completely, to hand over my birthright to strangers in exchange for promises of quick profit. That was the night the anger inside me turned into something sharper. For weeks I had been drowning in fear, shame, and confusion. But now, staring at that forged deed, I felt something else awaken inside me. My brother may have underestimated me, but he had also taught me something in his betrayal. When your back is against the wall, you either break or you fight, and I had no intention of breaking. I began documenting everything, every forged signature, every suspicious transaction, every false promise Daniel had made to creditors and partners. I dug through our father's old files, learning the language of contracts and ownership, teaching myself the very skills Daniel had used against me. Each night I filled notebook after notebook with details, connections, time. What began as desperation slowly became strategy. At the same time, I played my role carefully. Around Daniel, I remained quiet, even timid. I let him believe I was defeated, broken, too overwhelmed to resist. He grew bolder, more careless, convinced that he had me under his control. But behind the mask, I was building my case, brick by brick, word by word. There were moments of unbearable pain along the way, like the day I overheard him speaking to one of his associates, laughing about how naive I was. "She still thinks family means something," he sneered. "That's why she'll never fight me. She doesn't have it in her." I nearly walked into the room right then, nearly screamed at him until my throat bled, but I held back. I swallowed the pain, turned it into fuel, let him think I was weak, let him believe I was harmless. It would only make my strike more devastating when the time came. The hardest part was keeping up appearances with the rest of the family and community. People whispered, of course. They saw the tension, the cracks in our partnership. But I refused to air the full truth. Not yet. I smiled at gatherings. I nodded through conversations, all while my insides twisted with anger. And every night when I returned to my room, I whispered to myself the same promise. I will not let him win. The first real opportunity came unexpectedly, in the form of an old friend of my father's, Mr. Hughes, a retired lawyer who had known our family for decades. He had noticed my growing distress and offered to look over some of the documents with me. At first, I was hesitant. The shame of admitting how deeply my brother had betrayed me was almost unbearable. But when I finally laid out the papers on his desk, he frowned in silence for a long time. Then he said the words that lit a fire in me. "These signatures could put your brother in prison." Prison, the word echoed in my ears. Until then, I had thought only of survival, keeping the land, clearing my name, but now I realized Daniel's betrayal carried consequences far greater than financial ruin. He had committed crimes, serious crimes, and the law could bring him down still. I wasn't ready to move yet. Mr. Hughes advised patience. "Gather everything," he said. "If you strike too soon, he'll wriggle free. Men like him always do. But if you wait, if you build your case solid and unbreakable, you can bring him down so hard he'll never rise again." So I waited. I watched. I endured. Every forged document that crossed my desk became another weapon in my arsenal. Every careless word Daniel spoke became another thread in the rope I would use to hang his lies. And slowly, painfully, I began to see the outlines of my revenge forming. But Daniel wasn't stupid. He began to sense my shift, subtle as it was. One evening, he cornered me in the study, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You've been quiet lately," he said, swirling his drink as he studied me. "Not like before. What are you planning?" I forced a tired smile, lowering my gaze. "Nothing, Daniel. I'm just tired." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Don't make the mistake of thinking you can outsmart me. You never could." I met his eyes then, just long enough for him to see a flicker of something, defiance maybe, or strength. His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw a flash of unease in his face. He knew, deep down, he knew I was no longer the sister who followed blindly. No longer the woman who would remain silent while he destroyed everything we had, and that realization, that fear in his eyes gave me the strength I needed to keep going. Because my story wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about preparation. About sharpening my weapons in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, Daniel would finally learn that the sister he thought too weak to fight was capable of bringing him to his knees. The day I began my revenge was not marked by fireworks or declarations. It began quietly with a folder tucked beneath my arm as I walked into Mr. Hughes's office. For months, I had lived in silence, collecting evidence, enduring Daniel's arrogance, and pretending to be broken. But now, my folder was thick, heavy with documents, contracts, forged signatures, financial transfers, every piece of his deceit, laid bare on paper. I placed it on the desk like a weapon. Mr. Hughes flipped through page after page, his expression hardening with each passing moment. "This is enough to bury him," he finally said, his voice low. "Forgery, fraud, attempted theft of family property, it's all here." I felt my chest tighten, but not with fear. With certainty. For the first time, I could see the road ahead clearly. My brother had built his world on lies, but now those lies had structure, form, and proof, and I would use them to tear him apart. We began carefully. Mr. Hughes introduced me to a private investigator, a quiet man named Franklin who had once worked for law enforcement. He moved like a shadow, slipping into Daniel's world without leaving a trace. Within weeks, he returned with photographs, recordings, and testimonies. Daniel's business partners were more than opportunists. They were men with histories of fraud and corruption. Together, they had been weaving webs of deceit that stretched far beyond our family estate. The evidence grew until it was no longer just a folder. It became boxes, files, hours of recordings. And with each new revelation, my anger sharpened into something colder, something almost clinical. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about screaming or breaking dishes. It was about precision. It was about patience. It was about letting your enemy trap themselves so completely that when you pull the rope, they hang by their own design. Meanwhile, I continued my act. Around Daniel, I was the same weary, defeated sister. I nodded when he bragged, smiled weakly when he mocked my caution. Inside, though, I was steel. Every word he spoke in arrogance became another reminder that I was doing the right thing. Every smirk on his face fed the fire that burned inside me. The first strike came through the bank. With Mr. Hughes's help, I arranged a meeting with their fraud department. I laid out the forged signatures, the unauthorized loans, the trail of transactions Daniel had disguised as family. Investments, their faces darkened as they realized the depth of the deception. By the end of the meeting, they had opened an official investigation. Daniel's empire had just been pierced with its first crack, but I didn't stop there. I reached out to some of Daniel's partners, quietly and carefully. Men who had lost money in his schemes, men he had cheated as carelessly as he had cheated me. I showed them copies of the documents, pointed them toward the evidence. I didn't need to say much. Resentment did the rest. One by one, they began to turn on him, withdrawing support, demanding repayment, cutting ties. Daniel, who had strutted through dinners and meetings like a king, suddenly found his court emptying, and still I stayed quiet. Still I waited, because the final blow had to be perfect. That chance came sooner than I expected. Daniel had organized a gathering at the Estaton event to impress what few allies he had left. He wanted to show strength, to prove that his world was intact. But I had already set the stage that evening. I dressed carefully. Not in morning black, not in the tired clothes of a woman beaten down, but in a gown my mother once wore, elegant and dignified. I wanted Daniel to see me, not as his victim, but as his equal or better. As his reckoning, the guests arrived. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through the halls. Daniel played his role, charming, confident, the master of ceremonies. But beneath the surface, cracks were showing. Whispers drifted through the crowd, questions about his finances, doubts about his credibility. He laughed him off, but I saw the tightness in his jaw. He knew the tide was shifting when the moment came. I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the center of the room, holding a single envelope. The conversations hushed, eyes turned toward me. Daniel frowned, clearly annoyed by my interruption. "What are you doing?" he hissed, trying to smile for the guests. "I'm telling the truth," I said, my voice steady. I opened the envelope and began pulling out documents, one by one, contracts with forged signatures. Bank statements, evidence of fraud. Gasps filled the room as I laid them on the table for all to see. "These," I said, "are the deals Daniel has made, the lies he has told, the crimes he has committed not just against me, but against many of you standing here tonight." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of papers rustling. Daniel's face drained of color, then flushed red with rage. He lunged forward, snatching at the documents. Lies. All lies. But Franklin, the investigator, stepped from the shadows with a camera. "Not lies," he said coolly. "Evidence, and copies have already been sent to the authorities." The room erupted. Guests whispered, some stormed out, others stared in horror. Daniel's carefully constructed world collapsed in an instant, and I stood there calm, watching it crumble. But my revenge wasn't finished. I didn't just want to expose him publicly. I wanted to take from him the one thing he valued above all else: control. In the days that followed, the bank froze his accounts. His partners severed ties, lawsuits piled up like storm clouds. And through it all, I remained steady, pushing forward with quiet determination. The final confrontation came one stormy evening when Daniel burst into the study. His face twisted with desperation. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted. "I'm your brother." I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the boy who once held my hand, but the man who had tried to destroy me. "You stopped being my brother the moment you chose greed over family," I said. "This isn't me doing something to you, Daniel. This is you reaping what you sowed." He stared at me, trembling with fury, then collapsed into the chair, his bravado gone. For the first time, he looked small, defeated, and I realized then that revenge wasn't about destroying him, it was about reclaiming myself. About proving that I was not the weak, naive sister he believed me to be. I had taken back my name, my home, my dignity, and in the ashes of his downfall, I had found my strength. The weeks following Daniel's downfall were a blur of court hearings, interviews, and quiet evenings where I sat alone, staring into the fire. The estate, once filled with noise and tension, seemed almost haunted by the absence of his voice. Yet in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The world believed my battle was over. To them, I had won. My brother was disgraced, his empire dismantled, and my dignity restored. But inside, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because revenge, no matter how precise, never leaves you whole. It leaves scars, some seen, many unseen. And I had one last test to face. One final twist in this journey that I could not ignore. Daniel, though stripped of wealth and reputation, still carried one thing: resentment. He refused to accept defeat. He appealed every lawsuit, fought every accusation, and whispered threats through the few connections he had left. To him, losing wasn't an end, it was a challenge. And I knew if I didn't end this properly, he would claw his way back into my life like a shadow that refuses to fade. Then came the letter, delivered one rainy morning by a courier. Its envelope bore Daniel's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, in words sharp with venom, he wrote, "You may have one for now, sister, but you will never destroy me. Blood is thicker than law, and blood remembers." I felt the old fear rise in my chest, the same fear he had planted in me for years. But I breathed deeply, forcing it down. This wasn't the beginning of a new cycle of vengeance. This was my moment to end it on my terms. With Mr. Hughes's guidance, I arranged one final confrontation, not in secret, not in shadows, but in court. I brought every piece of evidence, every witness, every voice that Daniel had silenced or betrayed. I stood taller than I ever thought I could. The trial stretched for days. Daniel raged, argued, tried to twist every word, but the truth was no longer his to bend. The evidence spoke louder than his lies, and in the end, the gavel fell with finality. Guilty, sentenced. His freedom was gone, just as surely as his empire. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes, letting the weight lift from my shoulders. Justice was done. The cycle was broken. And yet, as I walked out of the courthouse, the rain falling soft and cool against my skin, I realized something profound. I had not just defeated Daniel, I had defeated the part of myself that once believed I needed him, that once believed I was powerless against him. My true victory wasn't in his downfall, it was in my rebirth. The months that followed were a season of rebuilding. I poured my energy into restoring the estate not as a monument to wealth, but as a place of healing. Rooms once used for Daniel's schemes became spaces for community gatherings, charity events, and shelters for those who had nowhere else to go. The estate became more alive than it had ever been under his reign. One evening, standing on the balcony overlooking the gardens, I watched as children laughed and played among the roses, their joy echoing across the grounds. My heart swelled with a warmth I hadn't felt in decades. This was what power was meant to be: not control, not greed, but the ability to create light where once there had only been shadows. And in that moment, I understood. My story wasn't one of betrayal alone. It was one of resilience, of transformation, of hope. Daniel had tried to break me, but in doing so, he had forged me into someone stronger. His betrayal was the fire, but I emerged from it not as ashes, but as steel. As I close this chapter of my life, I leave you with this: betrayal may cut deep, but it does not have to define you. Revenge may bring satisfaction, but true healing comes when you take back your story and use it to build something greater than what was stolen. For me, the estate is no longer just land and stone. It is a sanctuary, a reminder that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will always come. And as the sun sets on this chapter, I stand unafraid of the shadows because I know now they cannot touch me. I am not the woman Daniel tried to destroy. I am the woman who turned his betrayal into the foundation of my strength. This is my story, and it ends not with despair but with hope. Asterisk, if this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced betrayal and found the strength to rise above it? Your words may inspire someone else who is walking through a similar storm. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to her true story, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful journey of resilience and hope. Together, let's build a community where real stories remind us that no matter how deep the pain, there is always a path to healing.